I know how it feel to wake up, pockets broke as hell, another rock to sell. People look at you like you's the user, selling drugs to all the losers, mad Buddha abuser. But they don't know about your stress-filled day. Baby on the way, mad bills to pay. That's why you drink Tanqueray, so you can reminisce and wish you wasn't living so devilish. I remember I was just like you, smoking blunts with my crew, flipping over 62s, cause GED wasn't VIG. I had to get VAD, that's why my mom hate me. She was forced to kick me out, no doubt. Then I figured out, licks went for 20 down south. Packed up my tools for my raw power moves. Block 19 for casket and flower moves.
When I asked my dad to describe himself in regards to his childhood, he called himself a bad kid. After speaking with my dad, I wouldn't necessarily use those words. When we label black boys and girls bad kids, tell them they have no home training, how often do we pause and think about the foundations below those behaviors? How racism, poverty, and overall systematic disenfranchisement catalyzes those behaviors? How generational trauma carries and multiplies in the biological makeup of black and brown bodies? Talking to my dad kind of reminded me of a cat. You know how they say they have 9 lives, or when they fall, they always land on their feet? I find it necessary to start at the beginning of his story. So here we go. Monday morning, June 22nd of 1981, my dad was born Latrone Michael Hudson to Yvonne Hudson and Benny Colton in Davenport, Iowa. But unlike many of the newborn babies that would be born that day, he would not be coming home with his mother. Instead, he would be in the care of the Department of Human Services for the next month of his life. Just when he was about to be adopted, his Aunt Dorothy would come and pick him up because she didn't want him to be raised by a white family. He would then go to be under the care of his mother. But as someone who was suffering from schizophrenic and bipolar disorder, she had a really hard time taking care of him. Benny resided in Mississippi, making Yvonne a single mother. My dad was malnourished and improperly attended to, and he lived like this for a few months, until finally in October of 1981, 2 women named Lori and Vera visit the home of Yvonne, where they would see my dad, just a baby, experiencing hardship. They would go home later that day and plead with her mother, Ivy Lee Wells, to adopt the child. And so she did. And so although my dad was born in Davenport, Iowa, let him tell it to you, he's from what we call the town, aka Rock Island, Illinois. After he was adopted, he would move across the body of water to this small town where he would live in the turnkey projects with his adoptive mother, and really the only mother that he knows, and his name would be changed to Michael Latrone Wells. They would move around a few times before they settled down in the house that my grandmother has lived in my entire life. And throughout his childhood, my dad's experiences were not like the childhood most parents may dream of for their children. And really, it was nothing like I imagined. The first time my dad was kicked out of school, he was in the 2nd grade. And at just 9 years old, my dad would be arrested for the first time. At school, he was bullied for not having name brand clothing and for the birthmark that covers the right side of his face. At home, he would sometimes feel othered, never really having friends or feeling close to his siblings as they were many years his senior. He would build close bonds with some of his cousins and nieces. But when they moved to Germany for a while, it left just him and his mom. A lonely child, he would start indulging in risky behaviors. And once he started, it would be difficult for him to stop. Snorting Tylenol pills, racking up 3 more arrests in the 5th grade, smoking cigarettes and marijuana, stealing from stores, breaking into cars, and running with gangs at only 10 years old. And then one of the biggest events of his childhood would occur. During this time period, in the area where my dad lived, there was an ongoing beef between Mexicans and African Americans. Bikes had started going missing, and a group of Mexican kids would pay the consequences. They assumed my dad had snitched on them, and walking home one day, they threatened to kill him after school the following evening. Afraid, he would bring a loaded gun to school. When he arrives at school, he would immediately place the gun in his locker. Thankfully, he was caught when Grandma would notice the gun missing from her underwear drawer. My dad was expelled and is sent to jail. where he is placed on juvenile probation for 2 years. Right along with him, Grandma Ive was arrested for the first time in her life and forced to pay a $380 fine, which she struggled to pay with her fixed income. A few years later, now in the 7th grade, he desperately wanted to turn his life around. A student at Washington Junior High School, he began playing football and progressively doing better. That is until his old life would start to catch up with him. He became a foot soldier in the Quad Cities Vice Lords gang. A semester later, he was expelled for assaulting the dean of the school. And because at this point the only other junior high school did not want him there, he would finish his junior high experience at Thurgood Marshall Learning Center, which he referred to as a prison. While at Thurgood, my dad would receive a second 2-year probation for malicious destruction of hotel property. After Thurgood, he would attend Rock Island High School, where he would start dating a girl he had met over the summer. This girl was my mom, Tanisha. For a while, things were great between them. He felt he had finally had someone who understood him. That was until she cheated. After that, he would never be the same. He would run away for a few days, hurt and confused. And when he returned, he would get into a big fight with a friend at school. He received a 10-day suspension. But you may recall, my dad was still on probation at the time. And because he had violated the conditions of his parole, he would have earned himself a day in court. On January 4th, 1996, my dad assumed that he would be going home like usual. But instead, he was sent to Arrowhead Youth and Family Services for 18 months, where he would have no choice but to follow the rules. Though my dad learned many life lessons at Arrowhead, there was no place like home. He would receive a successful discharge, and when he returned home, he would have his driving license and start his first job at Rexy's Gourmet House. My mom had waited for him. Throughout those years, their relationship would be extremely complicated, with my dad being unfaithful and inconsistent with his personal growth. Despite this, they would have me in June of 2000, just 1 year after my mom had graduated high school. Unfortunately, my dad never did, because the lessons he learned at Arrowhead would be overshadowed by the pressure of temptation and a lack of opportunity. At Arrowhead, he had shattered his knee, so sports was no longer a way out. And in more ways than one, he would continue to go down a dark path. 3 years after me, my brother Michael Jr. would be born. The same year, my dad learned about the death of his biological father and would attempt to build a relationship with his biological family. 3 years after Michael, Jada was born. But 2006 was also a rough year. It was the same year my dad would be caught in a raid with crack cocaine, which he had been selling, and he would spend 4 months in jail. It was the same year he and my mom called it quits for good, and he was put out. It was the same year he met Kiwanda. The same year he began neglecting his children and his family overall. For a few years, no one would really hear from my dad. He had moved back to Davenport, and that's where he stayed. What we did not know is that with Kiwanda, he was going through things that as a black man, he was too prideful to share. They would become homeless. Kiwanda would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was losing weight rapidly, and my dad would become a victim of domestic violence. Even with a relationship full of violence and toxicity, they would still date for 7 years. Until one day, he could no longer mentally survive. He would get back on his feet with some government assistance and a lot of assistance from the drug business, and soon meet Tiffany. They would move in together and do well until they realized they could no longer trust each other. In 2015, my dad's life would finally start to turn around. He would meet Tyanda on Facebook, and they would hit it off immediately. He would start working security full-time and taking music more seriously. He'd also start building a better relationship with his 3 children. 3 years later, in May of 2018, my dad and Tyanda would be getting married in Vegas. The following year, they would celebrate their first anniversary in California. Months later in September, my dad's life would change once again. He got sick, chest pain. They hospitalized him for a week for monitoring, but he would check himself out to go watch the football game. A week later, he was in his bedroom, and when he stood up, he fell to the ground, unable to feel his legs and feet. Like most men when they are in crisis, he thought he could shake it off and rest. But when he realized that he could not stand, he immediately called 911. After that, he blacked out. The next thing he can recall is being told that he had undergone a 13-hour-long open heart surgery in Iowa City, Iowa, 30 minutes from where I had just begun my second year of college. My dad's aorta had torn. 6 days later, he died. Flatlined for 45 long seconds on October 12, 2019, from blood clots in his lungs. The entire week after he flatlined is gone from my dad's memory. He would spend several weeks in the hospital. He couldn't walk, couldn't eat, and he couldn't talk to us for what felt like forever. Because his kidneys were failing him, he had to be placed on dialysis. But eventually he would be brought back to Rock Island around early November, where he had to spend 2 weeks doing physical therapy, learning to walk again, and gaining some of his strength back. He made it home by Thanksgiving, and by New Year's his kidneys were back in good condition and his heart was getting stronger. Today my dad is doing much better, but the hardships unfortunately have not ended. He would lose a brother in 2019 and a nephew in 2020. He would experience depression and shame for not being able to care for himself in the way that he used to. He would break his leg at the top of 2022. Not to mention, as someone considered disabled, he relies on Social Security income and runs into many issues with the healthcare system. But somehow, he continues to land on his feet. My dad likes to tell people he is currently in his second life, for which he is so grateful. So now every day he wakes up and tries to spread more love and positivity. As you have heard, his life is not easy, some of which may be the fault of his own, sure. But I encourage you to remember that from the moment my dad was born, he was systematically disadvantaged. It's a true blessing that he's not dead or in prison, because those are the life chances and trajectories caused by the burden of being a black man in America.
Love you once, love you twice, love you more than beans and rice. Y'all have a giant night.